welcome our speakers today, Ed Usset, who's a grain marketing economist. He's from the Center for Farm Financial Management at the University of Minnesota. Our other speaker today is Pete Boulay. Pete is a climatologist with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, Ecological and Water Resources, located on St. Paul campus at the University of Minnesota. At this point in time, though, I'm going to turn it over to Ed Usset. And Ed is a longtime University of Minnesota economist in the grain marketing area. And Ed, we certainly had our situation here in Minnesota, as well as the United States, with some ups and downs, everything from the crop report coming out tomorrow on Thursday, indicating that we're going to be long in terms of soybean volume and corn volume here in the United States. It seems like every time it rains in Argentina, it makes a difference here in our price situation here locally in Minnesota. And then also, I think you want to touch a little bit about some of the things that are happening here in the state in terms of basis, developing more soybean crushing opportunities, et cetera. So with that, Ed, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you've got a couple of slides you'd like to share with the audience here as well.
Okay, thank you, Dave, and good morning to everyone. I see there are 80 participants online. Dave, you did very well getting people here. Just some observations on my part about the grain market. And I'll lay out very briefly the bullish argument for prices in the next 6 months. If you look at world wheat ending stocks, taking China out of the equation, and I'm going to focus on this in a moment, the situation is the tightest in 15 years. Same is true with world corn ending stocks without China projected pretty low again. Basis is strong. I want to talk just a moment for basis. I just looked, some of you might be thinking basis is strong. It's backed off in the last, with the new year. Yes, it has. The corn basis, southwestern Minnesota, maybe hanging around 5 under the March. It was 10 over 6 weeks ago. The soybean basis, which was option price a month and a half ago, is now 25 under the March. I want to remind people of something, and that is the current basis levels we see in southern, southwestern Minnesota are the best I have on record in over 30 years. The only year better is the 2012-13 drought year. Basis is strong. It is backed off because it's a new tax year, and grain is beginning to move some. The numbers, purely of ending stocks to use, worldwide view of things, make the case for strong prices through the first half of the year. And I know what you're thinking, but that's not what we've seen, Ed. I'll talk about that. The bearish argument, we've got a strong dollar, high prices, lagging export and ethanol demand. You may be focused on problems in Argentina. I will tell you that the way things are going in Brazil, which is 2 thumbs up, overshadows problems in Argentina. The bottom line on the bearish argument is world demand is adapting to the current high price environment. Well, I want to take you into some analysis I've done. I like similar years analysis. I like picking up on a specific fundamental factor in the market and analyzing those years. Let's start with wheat. And even though many of you listening, you may not grow wheat unless you're up in the northwestern part of the country. Nevertheless, wheat is a major commodity worldwide, might be the most important food grain other than rice. And if you look at world ending stocks of wheat over the last 30 years, it doesn't look that bad, a little tighter than it has been in recent years. But we've got a phenomena going on in this world, and that is China is on a different track. And they have been building their wheat and corn stocks for a number of years. They're very fearful of, from a political standpoint, of a repeat of the Great Famine of 60 years ago. So they're building up stockpiles. And if you look at the world ending stocks to use situation without China, you get a different picture. Okay. And I picked up on, I believe it's 8 different years where we've had a similar situation where world wheat ending stocks without China are less than 20%. Let's look at those 8 years, which includes this year. Let's look at the last, it's 7 years. Let's look at the last 6 years. And I'm looking at the Minneapolis May spring wheat futures from harvest until the following April and looking at the price change. In those similar years, 5 of the 6 years went higher, and the one down year was not much down. Now, having said that, I'm laying out a bullish case. So far, we're down 5% since last August. It's not playing out that way. But fundamentally, the fundamentals are favorable to the market. I can do the same with corn. You can look at world corn ending stocks to use, which from a world standpoint don't look that terrible, even though they are lower than they were a few years ago. But again, China has been building stocks. You take China out of the equation, they're not exporting wheat and corn. And you see that the world ending stocks to use situation without China in the equation is less than 10%. And we've only had, I think, 9 years prior to that over the last 30 years like that. Let's look at those years. I'm looking at July corn futures from harvest until the following May, a 7-month period. You look at those previous 9 years, 7 of the 9 years, the prices traded higher. Only twice did it go lower. Now, having said that, again, I update it for the market as of October 1 of 2022. And just a couple days ago, we're at 648. We're down 34 cents or 5%. Okay. Fundamentals are there for a stronger market. Now, I've got some caveats there. I'm making the argument that prices could remain strong through the first half of the year, but so far it's not happening. Prices are high. They remain high. There's a regression to the mean, if you will, going on. Ending stocks to use as a projection. I am not unaware that we've got a big WASDE report coming out tomorrow. I think the market is anticipating that USDA will raise the size of last year's corn and soybean crop, at least the corn crop. They're anticipating cuts in the demand projections in ethanol and exports. And here's a bold prediction on Ed's part. And by the way, keep in mind when I make bold predictions, I'm wrong often. But my own sense is if they do these things, raise the size of the crop, decrease demand, the market will be higher. It's a classic buy the rumor, sell the fact anticipation. One other thing, 3 consecutive years of a post-harvest corn price rally are pretty damn rare, and this would be the 3rd year like that. It's hard to find something like that. And by the way, a lot of this is driven by international events, a war in Ukraine, a major grain producing and exporting country. And your guess is as good as mine where that goes. Now, what I'd like to do with just a couple minutes here, I'd like to talk about the golden age of American agriculture. And I have a point here. I'd like to talk about 2 golden ages in American agriculture, 1914 to 19, 100 years ago, and most recently, 2007 to 2014, just to ask what causes that. The first golden age I won't dwell on, except it does give me the chance to show you a picture of my great-grandparents in western Wisconsin who could afford a camera on their 100 acres. That first golden age is the decade leading up to and during World War I. And I make the argument that it is World War I that drove that golden age. It was a golden age for American agriculture because Europe was at war. World War I was trench warfare in France. And France is the major grain producing country in Europe. It upset production. And by the way, in 1917, we had a little thing called the Russian Revolution, which I don't have the numbers before me. We can only guess upset production in Ukraine and Russia at that time, too. So war is one factor. And of course, what do we have going on right now? War in Ukraine. Don't know where that's going. How about this second part? 10 years ago, I wrote a column for Corn and Soybean Digest where I celebrated another golden age of American agriculture, 2007 to 2014. I made the argument it was a golden age, and there it is. You can see it in the national average grain prices for corn, wheat, and soybeans. That bulge stands out at that time. Well, the question is, what drove that golden age? I've made the argument that the number one driver was right here, the rapid expansion of ethanol production in the US in the 2000 to 2010 period. I got my 15 minutes of fame in the Star Tribune during that time when a reporter asked me, why are wheat prices up? Why are soybean prices up? Why are corn prices up? And I gave the flip answer that the answer is ethanol. Ethanol expansion is drawing more acres into corn production, and more acres of corn production means less of something else. It was affecting the supply and demand of everything. So I'm asking a question here. How did the rapid expansion of ethanol production affect planted acres in corn? Well, from 1990 to 2000, so to this 10, 11-year period, before the ethanol boom took off, how many acres of corn were planted? Well, it was 71 to 80 million acres a year in that 10-year period. How about the 10 years after the ethanol boom, 2010 to 2020? How many acres of corn were planted? Well, we're routinely 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 million more acres a year since then. We need it to support the ethanol boom. Why do I bring this up? That was a rapid demand increase. Is anyone paying attention to what's going on in the world of soybeans? Do you know that in the US, we have currently 16 publicly announced expansions or new facilities announced in soybean crushing over the next 1 to 4 years? This is over $3 billion of investment in soybean crushing. It is driven by renewable diesel and requirements. This is going to increase crush capacity by 25%. This is not something that's going to affect the market this year, but it's only 2 to 4 years out. Okay, I'm going to do a little math. Our current US crush is 2.2 billion bushels. A 25% expansion, and I think it's a little more than that if it all happens, 550 million bushels are needed to support that expansion. That's 10.5, 11 million acres. Okay. Others are doing the math. US Wheat Associates put out something that they thought were going to need 20 to 25 million additional acres of soybeans. CoBank did the math and said, we need another it's a pretty exact number there, 17.9 million additional acres of soybeans. What's my point here? Where do those acres come from? Where do they come from? Do they continue to come out of wheat and other small grains? Are we fighting for corn? That's a battle. That same battle in the world of corn drove that second golden age. And I look out ahead 2 to 4 years, and I just wonder how this is going to impact prices 2 to 4 to 5 years out. So what generates a golden age? Well, war is an issue, and rapid demand increase is an issue. And we've got both things going on right now. I'll just wrap up with a few final thoughts. I've gone through some similar years and I've made a positive case for grains, but you know what? It's not happening yet. I tell people you should be looking for pricing opportunities of 2000 for the 2023 and last year's crop. 3 consecutive years of strong corn price rallies are rare. Continue to look for pricing opportunities. I'm very fearful that I've got people convinced to be very bullish and you're not going to sell anything. Don't approach marketing that way. Go for a good average price. Is another golden age on its way? I wonder. But and yet, as you think of the positive impact on that it could have on prices, it's not going to happen this year. It's a couple of years off. Dave, I turn it back to you.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to do one quick question here before we turn it over to Pete that came in, and it's one that I had too. If you could succinctly project if the report tomorrow comes out with a higher carryout and we can actually have more corn and soybeans, and if you are a grower in Minnesota and maybe you haven't priced in and completed all of your 23 marketing plans, and if this thing comes up with a little bit more supply, and it becomes in situations with that, along with corn, exports have been trending down. Any quick comments about what people should be doing or paying attention to if they haven't done so already, if this report comes in and we are bullish, so to speak, on supply, maybe limited on the corn demand? One comment there, I guess.
Well, here's the thing. I just mentioned that if in fact we see sort of a bearish report that is bigger supply, less demand, I actually expect prices to go higher because I think the market has been soft for 4 to 6 weeks, and we have been anticipating this for a long time. It is a classic buy the rumor, sell the fact type issue. Producers who have grain they haven't sold from last year yet, haven't started on next year, get some ideas together and put some numbers down where you're willing to take action. Price opportunities for 2023 are still above production costs, not by a hell of a lot, but they're above them. And it's an opportunity to get started. Again, you're not trying to sell the high price in the market. You are, but you're not going to do it. I hate to pop your balloon. You're not going to do it. Shoot for a good average price, and starting today is part of that.
Okay. Thank you, Ed. You're going to hang in there. We're going to have opportunity as we go along here for more Q&A or questions in the program. But for right now, we're going to go switch back to Pete Boulay, climatologist with the Minnesota DNR. And Pete, everyone wants to know, we got all this snow, all right? We got this moisture that's coming in here, and obviously with a lot of that, does it amount to that much? I mean, we've got a lot in early January, but then, every time we see a drought map, we're in a slight to a low to a moderate drought in a good chunk of Minnesota with this. Our bottom line is, Pete, are you optimistic?
Okay, so here we are. We were so used to a wet 2010s. So from 2010 to 2019, wet every year. A series of wet years. And it's almost like we got used to this kind of wet regime. Then 2020 came along, was the first of a series of dry years in the state. So 2020 probably isn't on a lot of people's radar, but that's really when this drought series began. And we had so much water stored in the soil was that basically we were drawing from the bank in all of 2020. So things weren't too bad in 2020. 2021 came along. Another drought, this time in northern Minnesota, was the main focus, and it had a bigger impact. Luckily for us, it was we got bailed out of that drought in the fall of 2021, and then a drought began anew in 2022 and basically shifted south and affected more from the Twin Cities on to Lamberton in southwest Minnesota. That was the focus of that drought. And we began to get precipitation again in the fall a little bit, especially November, right before the soils froze up in November. There we go. Maybe we'll have, there we go. Yay. Eventually we'll get it. So Yeah, you might as well scroll ahead a couple slides. Our website's a good one to for everybody to take a look at. And then basically, yeah, go forward a little bit. So basically, this was the first real slide to show what has happened. We had such a surplus of moisture over that period of 2010 to 2019. Lakes were high, stream flow was always high. Everybody's ditches were flowing, tile lines were flowing all the time. And 40 to 50 inches of surplus moisture in some counties. I kind of highlighted Redwood County as one of the areas that had robust precipitation the whole time. Now, notice it wasn't universal for the whole state. We got to take in mind that Minnesota is a big state, a lot of variation in weather across the state. So it was a little drier up north during that period. Next slide, Dave. So basically, the drought series are kind of the wet regime ended in 2020, and a few exceptions where they got some direct hits of some storms, like in Sibley and Nicollet County. Otherwise, 2020 started dry. And then next slide, following in, and when it really made an impact was in 2021, where especially in the northern half of the state was very dry. A few exceptions, west central Minnesota. There's always a few exceptions in any drought. Going back to 1988, there was a few places that still saw rain. Next slide, Dave. 2021 drought, here is where it was the worst. The peak of the 2021 drought was in August in northwest Minnesota, but everybody in the state, except in the far southeast, had at least a moderate dry conditions. Okay, next slide, Dave. And then the next drought, which I'm calling the 2022-2023 drought because we're still in it today. The worst of it, the peak, was in November 2022, a little bit later than the drought in 2021. Shifted south, most intense in that area that was in extreme drought. Next slide, Dave. So just to highlight that area to see how bad it was, from June through October 2022, we selected all these counties from basically east central Minnesota to the southwest. And it was the driest on record for putting all those counties together from June through October. So things were looking pretty dire in the fall. Next slide, Dave. So currently, this is the drought situation as of last week. A new drought monitor will be coming out tomorrow. And this drought monitor that's coming out tomorrow on Thursday reflects the big storm that we just had. This map did not have that in there yet. So you might expect a few improvements from that storm we just had, but we'll have to wait and see. Next slide, Dave. So soil moisture in Lamberton. So it's all about the soil moisture, and very concerned in 2022 as we kept falling throughout the year. Things are looking pretty bad in October, that record dry October. And then November, we began to get at least some precipitation into the ground. The old adage is, early in the fall, your efficiency for getting into the ground is about 38%. Late fall, after everything's, there's no crop, there's less intense rains, about 70%. And that played out here at Lamberton. We had enough precipitation to boost up soil moisture levels a little bit before freeze up. Next slide, Dave. So just kind of highlighting where the worst was from the 2022 drought. This is August 16th through middle of December, and the darker, the warmer levels was where it was the driest. And this shows it's not just a Minnesota thing. This extended down into Iowa, and the drought was much worse as you go farther south. Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, all those places had a worse drought than us. Next slide. So it's starting a little bit of hope here. Here's what's happening since basically middle of November through basically this week. So this is a departure from normal precipitation map, and it's well above normal in the range of 3/4 to an inch above normal for a good chunk of Minnesota. Most of this had fallen in the form of snow, except in the southeast where there was a decent amount of rain. Rochester set its record one-day rainfall of over an inch in January earlier this month. Next slide, Dave. The other point of hope, Ground frost. There is not deep frost. It is not robust. Out here on campus here, I dug away the snow to take a snow core. And there was about 3 inches of water in the snow. Not only that, my metal ruler, I could dig up clumps of topsoil. And very importantly, I could clump the topsoil in my hand, which means there's moisture in the topsoil. Not sure how far down that's going, but that's one of those encouraging signs. There's been winters where we've had a deep kind of a concrete frost. That is not the case, at least in Minnesota for this year so far. We got a couple months of winter to go, so a lot of things could still happen. But for right now, we're not seeing much in frost. The peak of frost usually is at the end of February, beginning of March. Next slide, Dave. So Ed brought up an interesting point about 2012. 2012 is one of those real benchmark years, not only for the drought, not just here, but the entire upper Midwest. And Minnesota didn't have it as bad as other places like Illinois, Iowa, places like that. They're big corn states. We did okay. And the reason why we did okay is notice in the soil moisture there in the middle of June, we had a little bit of a bounce, just enough to replenish the soil moisture and give those roots that can go deep enough. That deep soil moisture was still there. We were very worried towards the end of the year, though, in 2012 for the availability of soil moisture in 2013. So the big question, how much can you recover from a really dry year? So Dave, next slide. Here's 2013. So obviously we started out pretty much where we left off in 2012, but notice what happened in the spring in 2013. We had a rebound and pretty much right back to long-term average soil moisture conditions. So you can recover. It's difficult to totally recover, though, over the winter. Next slide, Dave. One thing to keep in mind in the background that's always going on through the wet and the dry is overall the long-term growing season continues to get longer. This is the growing season length in Milan. This is one of our benchmark climate stations. There isn't much of a heat island in Milan, in Redwood County there. So this is a great station. It's been one family for over 100 years. And over time, we've seen just a gradual increase in growing season length. It used to be, in great grandfather's time, 125 days, and now it's up, about 147 days. So that's also going on throughout this entire period. Next slide, Dave. So I always throw this slide in there for fun. The Minnesota average corn yield from 1866 to last year. I think last year is still an estimate. One thing I always point out with this is, of course, it's not only drought that affects crops, but also extreme wetness. And in a lot of cases, 1993 was worse than 1988 in terms of crop yield because of the extreme wetness. And not just the extreme wetness, the timing of the wetness. The wetness in 1993 was during the entire summer, not just in the spring, not just in the fall, but during the peak growing season. So it really had an impact. And you can see we bounced up and down that trend line over the years. And it's always kind of interesting to see how little changes here and there in the trend with the weather. Next slide, Dave. So what about the future? Everybody wants to know, can we predict the future here in the climate office? Well, we can try, and we'll see what happens. Next slide, Dave. So the future, 8 to 14 days, temperature. We've been in this warm spell now for a couple weeks. December was well below normal. In Minnesota. So far, January is about as above normal as December was below normal. And at least that's probably going to continue right through most of the rest of January. We're going to stay above normal. Now, there's a big difference between above normal and way above normal, record above normal. So we're not really melting a lot of snow yet. We're above normal in sense of we're in the upper 20s instead of the middle 20s. There's been years where we've had some 50s in January, and that hasn't happened yet. Doesn't look like it's going to happen with such a robust snow cover, but mild conditions continue. Next slide, Dave. Precipitation looks like it's going to stay active, not just here, but for a good chunk of the U.S., staying wet, staying warm. And that's really been the pattern we've seen in 2023 so far. Big, juicy storms. There's another one on the horizon next week on Martin Luther King Day. It remains to be seen who's going to get the most precip. Right now, it's kind of favoring southeastern Minnesota and farther southeast, but it's still a long way out. But that just shows there's still active weather going on. Next slide, Dave. So what about the more distant future? This is the seasonal temperature outlook, February, March, and April of 2023. So what this basically tells me that the Climate Prediction Center is saying is we're still in a La Nina. This is a very classic La Nina pattern to see on the outlook, where it's below normal temperatures in the northwest, above in the south, equal chances for us here. And of course, we are on a kind of a waning La Nina. We're transitioning into a neutral phase of the ENSO pattern. The sea surface temperatures are transitioning from cooler to warmer, maybe even El Nino eventually. But we'll have to watch and see what happens. Next slide, Dave. So precipitation still staying kind of tilting towards a little bit wet, especially up in the northern part of the state. A little concerning that below normal to our south. Those are the areas that are in drought as well, and they might not get much help and get out of it in the spring. Next slide, Dave. Now, I don't know if anybody keeps a close eye on these outlooks, but wondering if anybody catches, does this look familiar to anybody? Next slide, Dave. It should, because last year at this time was almost the same outlook. Above normal precipitation, we equal chances, and below in the south. It was still La Nina, so the Climate Prediction Center was predicting this little bit of a normal or above normal precipitation in the Great Lakes and Wisconsin, even parts of Minnesota. How did they do? That's the big question. How good was this forecast? Next slide, Dave. This is what actually happened in 2022. Next slide. So actually, they weren't bad. It was above normal for precipitation in the Great Lakes, in Wisconsin. They weren't quite right in northern Minnesota. It was wet. And of course, we had that flooding up in far northern Minnesota as well in the spring. Wet North Dakota too. But you know what? They didn't do half bad. So if they're as good as they were last year for the outlook, maybe we can, knock on wood, think they'll get it right again this time. Next slide. So in summary, 2010's extraordinary wet period, the wettest we've ever seen in Minnesota history. Things changed in 2020. The dryness began, picked up speed in 2021, had a little bit of a break, a new drought, but really we've had now 3 years of statewide below normal precipitation. It's been a long time since we've seen that. We've had worse droughts than this, but the drought scenario takes a while to get out of, and maybe 2023 will completely get out. If we stay as wet as we've been in January, we have a good shot at that. La Nina, that's been around for 3 years, is expected to transition to kind of a neutral phase during this from January to March. And then what that means in the spring, typically, if it's neutral, that's basically a three-sided coin. It could be above, below, or normal temperatures and precipitation. Not as much guidance as La Nina or an El Nino. So bottom line is, even though the general trend, we saw the growing season trends kind of warmer, and overall we still have been wetter. Always expect that variability from year to year. And not only that, within the state. Southeast Minnesota, they go, what drought? We don't have any drought. Southwest Minnesota, pretty bad drought. So it's a big state, lots of variability even within the state. Next slide. So any questions? And thank you, Dave, for pinch slide sorting for me. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. All right, we have an opportunity. Let's see if we have any questions and so forth. You touched it briefly on, I guess that was back when we were talking with Ed here. But I also had a question, actually. Ryan Miller, you were had a pop up here. I don't know, Ryan, if you want to jump on your microphone and so forth, but talk a little bit about recharge.
Yeah, so you mentioned recharge late fall when plants have senesced and precip might be happening. You get about 70% goes back into the soil is the number you threw out. Kind of curious about winter time on an average year, and then maybe does it vary from year to year? How much recharge do you get from some of these winter snowfalls, and what can we expect?
Good question, Ryan. So basically, it can vary a lot. it can go from like 5% to about 50% efficiency. So I think in this year right now, we're about at that 50% because there's no frost. So if it melted today, the 3 inches of water go right in the ground. There probably wouldn't be any ponding at all. And that's in central and southern Minnesota. Could be a few exceptions. You go farther north. But in general, right now, if we took the winter as we are at this moment, I think we get near that 50%. Absolutely. And it's already kind of happening. It's the soil temperature is above freezing, only about 8 inches down, 10 inches down. So it right now is slowly thawing from below going up. I've lost an inch of frost this month so far, even out here. Went from 4 to 3 inches. This is much frost. So that's actually really good news. Conversely, it might not be great news for pests. Our soil temperature is going to stay warm all winter long. If pests, I have a better shot at overwintering it now too.
Well, there's one thing, Ryan, and you're in southeastern Minnesota with alfalfa. We talk about snow cover, and Pete, you and I talked about this briefly before, and ice sheeting and so forth. But so far, we've got a lot of our alfalfa that's in that situation. So I think in some cases that's beneficial. I don't know if Ryan, if you have any comments on that either. But in terms of having that coverage over the top, but I think really with in situations with that one might be helpful. I don't know if we have any other quick questions, but Ed, since you're on the line, you heard what Pete has to say. Are you neutral, optimistic, or pessimistic yet when you think about this year's crop based upon what you've heard? And La Nina, I mean, this is a big worldwide weather thing in terms of that, but any thoughts that come to mind?
Well, I'm always optimistic, Dave. You have to be optimistic.
Right.
You can't be in the business of farming if you're not optimistic. And I laid out the case for being optimistic about strong prices through the first half of the year, and yet it's not happening right now. Stay tuned. We got a big report coming tomorrow. They're all big reports, but the January report is always a big one because it's the month when the USDA kind of makes its final adjustments to the previous crop. So there could be surprises.
You mentioned earlier about don't get too hung up on weather in Argentina versus Brazil, other places. Do you want to elaborate on that and that type of thing? We tend to have a lot of our media that hyper focuses on Argentina, but should we be thinking wider here?
Yeah, you have to think wider. And when you think of South America, the big brother is Brazil. Argentina is the little brother. And I'm talking in terms of production capabilities. I don't have the numbers to spew forth, but I'm just going to tell you that a good year in Brazil can easily make up for problems in Argentina. And right now we have a good year going in Brazil in terms of soybean production, and it will make up for any shortfall in Argentina. I feel for the Argentinian farmers. I don't know one of them. I know that it's a difficult time there when drought is prevalent, although they've had some recent rains. But Brazil is going well. And if Brazil is going well, the South American crop is going well.
Say, Pete, recently there's been a lot, obviously, in the media about all the rivers of rain into California and more zonal. Is that a phenomenon of the change in the ocean temperature out there, or why is California? Is that going to impact us in the Midwest at all?
Actually, our big storm we got was a little piece of that action. The big mess storm we call that happened at the beginning of this month. And you know what? That is a very classic El Nino pattern that they're seeing there right now. That's what we totally expect in an El Nino. So it's very interesting that it's like becoming El Nino-esque even before it's El Nino. So in some ways, it's very welcoming that it's starting to rain again there. They've had a long years of drought. So I'm hoping that it'll replenish the reservoirs and snow a lot in the mountains because that's where they get most of their water. So, but yeah, that's it. Absolutely. It's not a a La Nina pattern at all. So our La Nina is already weakening as we speak. So, I always hate to say, predicting too far out with what's going to happen with El Nino or La Nina, but it's definitely weakening right now. Absolutely. And it does look like the Pineapple Express is there, and it's going to continue for a little while still.
Is that moisture going to reach us and impact us, or does that peter out before it gets here?
Most of the time it's wrung out over the mountains. We usually don't get much of that, although once in a while you get a little something helps spin up in the southwest, and then we'll get that storm. It kind of juices up our storms a little bit sometimes. It's not a main factor for us, but it just shows the active pattern. That's the bottom line, is that pattern's going to stay active. As long as our flow is coming out of the southwest, that's where we're going to get our moisture. Alberta Clippers just aren't going to cut it. And we haven't had any of those now for quite a few weeks. So as long as our systems are coming out of the southwest, we have a better chance to get a classic Colorado low up here. Give not only us rain in Minnesota, but the entire upper Midwest. So it'll help out a lot of people when we get those things. It's already helping out Indiana. They're already, improving there too, other places to our east. So they're not just us getting wet. A lot of people are.
So we've got those I states down there, Ed, that can produce a lot of crop and so forth. And then I know, and if Pete has it rain some more, we might get this Mississippi River up a little bit more. But any thoughts about that impact as far as exporting down the Mississippi versus the other ways? Is that going to play big into our price scenario here in 2023 with the low river in the Mississippi, or do we have enough trains to push things around?
Well, it did have a big impact this fall. Will it have an impact this spring when the river, when we reopen for business? And next summer, well, that's all about, do we get enough rains to replenish it? And I think we're off to a good start there. It did have an impact, though, Dave, and a very simple example. The basis, I'm going back to last October, November, the basis for corn and soybeans was stronger in southwestern Minnesota than it was in Savage, which, of course, is where the many barges load to go down the river. That's strange, Dave. In fact, I don't have a 30-year record on the Savage basis, but the river has always been stronger than southwestern Minnesota. And the fact that got flipped last fall told you everything you needed to know about problems with the river. But yeah, we're getting the moisture now. Certainly that river is going to, you got to believe that the water levels are going to rise, and we're going to get back to a more normal shipping season when things reopen this spring.
One thing you haven't talked about a little bit, I know you're into the grains, but think about these livestock farmers. What are they looking at in terms of pricing for feed out here? Secure things are things going to be where they are at here for the foreseeable future for their some of their input and their feed prices on corn and that type of thing? We don't necessarily have a large expansion of cattle here in Minnesota. We have what basically we have, and it takes a while. The same for the hog numbers, but any comments about how that interacts with livestock and demand and prices on that side?
Yeah, I've already laid out my thoughts on corn, that I think prices, I can make the argument for prices remaining strong. I don't know if we get back into a rising price scenario, but prices are going to remain strong. So if we got corn buyers waiting for $4 corn, all I can say is don't hold your breath. You might hurt yourself. Soybean meal has been an interesting story because the crush has been so strong based on the demand for soybean oil that meal prices are high like everything else, but actually reasonable on a relative basis to everything else. And I expect that to continue. That's another side story to this expansion of the soybean crush industry. Again, 2 to 4 or 5 years out. We're doing this to produce oil. What do we do with all that meal? Could be an opportunity in the livestock world.
Okay. Pete, is there anything else that we didn't touch upon from weather, meteorological situation here, or trends? I think you talked a little bit about frost depth, and certainly that you don't see that as a factor that's going to cause us, problems there, or I don't even overland flooding. I mean, that's something we talk about there in the month of March. But any comments? I mean, are we going to see some issues with any of that, and what I would call overland flooding or problems in drainage, given the snowpack and what we might have the rest of the winter?
We have our first spring flood outlook meeting at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on the 24th. And that's when we get our first real big picture on the spring outlook. And then the Weather Service will start tying that in too. And also, they'll also do the Missouri River outlook too. That's a big component to the Mississippi for shipping. So they'll say what kind of percentages the snowpack is looking and how much runoff they anticipate. So there's a lot of things coming up. I am always worried about overland flooding. That's always in the back of my mind because it kind of sneaks up on you a little bit. I am worried about the size of the drifts I'm seeing out there a little bit because there's a lot of moisture so far, but it's hard to tell, what could happen. I mean, 2019 was a bad late season for getting kind of flooding overland around here at least. But it's hard to say. There's too much winter left to know for sure. But for flooding, we are missing a few key components. We're missing the frost. We're also missing we didn't have the heavy autumn precip. Stream flow was basically fairly low. So we have a lot of places for water to go. It would take a lot to get a real big flood year, I think, at this point. Never say never. I always think of 1965, which was, didn't maybe start out big, but it ended huge. So you could have an outstanding March. That can always happen. And that really changes everything. So, I would say we're in good shape so far. And just we'll have to keep waiting and see what happens.
So there is this question that came in from Max here. Does a lack of frost correlate with a dry spring and good planting conditions? So this is way far out there in terms of that. Any comments on that? I think we kind of touched on that a little bit, but.
I'm like thinking my title slide there was the corn was a little short last year on June 5th in Arlington. It's all about the spring. What Mark Silly used to say, I always see, ask me in April.
Yeah, that's right. That's what he used to. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know what? Basically, if you want an early spring, you got to shake the snow cover early. That's the first step. You can't really do much as long as you have a white snowpack going on, reflecting all that solar radiation. So, way too early to say anything, going on with this spring, but if we don't have any frost in the ground, what will happen is spring could come very fast because then there's nothing to thaw if we stay as we are here. So it's kind of a give or take there. We have a lot of snow to melt, but no frost. So think of like, I wish I had some good analogic years, 82, 83. There's 83, 84. Some of those mid 80s were like that with a deep snow cover, no frost. I think 82, 83 is one of them. And I don't remember what the spring happened in 83. All I remember is there was lots of storms in 83. So it was an active year all around. So maybe active winter becomes active summer. I wish I knew for sure.
Ed, you mentioned the reports coming out tomorrow on supply. Pay attention to that report, but then what else is coming up in terms of reports that producers should look at here in Minnesota in terms of helping to guide their marketing? Anything coming up here the rest of the winter to pay attention to, or locally, per se?
Not really. The January report is a very important one. Of course, WASDE comes out every month, but some reports, there's always the possibility of a surprise in a report. But like I said, the January one is where they sort of, USDA makes their final reconciliation, for lack of a better term, of the previous crop. So that's where we might expect a surprise. The February and March reports are traditionally tamer. The next big report you'll get after this January report, we're going to start talking about planted acres in 2023. The shift will be more corn, more soybeans, more wheat, less of one or another. And we won't have a good handle on that until we have the prospective plantings report at the end of March. So it might be the end of March before we see some fundamental news, earth-shaking news from a U.S. standpoint that can change things.
Well, obviously, crop input prices are in terms of commodity, prices input are high right now. It's going to limit a little bit about if they get the fertilizer down, last fall or this spring, if they switch acres back and forth. But time and again, sometimes it doesn't change dramatically here in the state. People go ahead with their plans in terms of rotation. Would you think that's the case of what you've seen over the past, and would anticipate that again?
I think that's very true, and there aren't going to be major changes coming into the spring, but that March report will be based on a survey and give us an indication of what changes producers were planning on.
Okay. All right. Well, we're just about to the end here. Any last points, Pete or Ed, at this point in time that you have for the folks on the webinar this morning?
No, weather's still staying active.
Right. Stay tuned to your forecast, Ed.
I'm always telling people, look for opportunities to price grain, old crop and new crop. Don't stand by. Don't get overly bullish based on some of the things I talked about today. I've been wrong before. Pay attention to your own operation, your own needs, and look for pricing opportunities.
Just say this morning, thanks for attending the Strategic Farming Let's Talk Crops program. And thanks again, Pete, and thank you much for Ed. And we'll see you folks next week on another version of Strategic Farming next Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock. Thank you.